Well, nice to see you. Yeah, as was just said, I'm Neil. So I'm a postdoc researcher at Kegel, and I teach New Testament in the theology faculty. So any theologians here might run into me in that capacity. I'm also on the staff at Oxford Presbyterian Church, just down the road. Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. So, what do Christians mean by the gospel? What is the gospel? It won't surprise you because this is Oxford and we're in an Oxford lecture theatre. We'll start with something etymological. The gospel derives from the Greek word euangelion, which simply means good news. And the original classical use for that word was to do with bringing back news of military victories from distant lands. So if you imagine Alexander the Great defeating King Bessus in 329 BC, you can imagine a gospel ringing out back home in Macedonia. Alexander has conquered the Persians, and now, like a complete nutjob, he's carrying on all the way to India. That's how gospel began, but over the years it became a bit more flexible than that, and so as time progresses you begin to hear people using this word gospel for more kind of everyday and mundane examples. An abundant harvest, like the birth of a child or something like that, is explained as a gospel. But the particular use of it that we want to zero in on today is this one that actually basically swallows up all of the other meanings in subsequent years. It's the distinctively Christian use of the word gospel, gospel as in the four gospels, gospel as in gospel music, gospel as in, I swear what I'm telling you is gospel truth. What's that all about? What is that? What's the happy announcement, the good news from a distant land that proclaims or presupposes? Well, in any situation like this, the first thing to understand is the context, isn't it? So you can't fully understand why Alexander's victory over Bessus is good news back in Macedonia if you don't know something about the history of rivalry and bloodshed between Macedonia and Persia in the foregoing years. And the same thing is true, I think, for all other Gospels. You can only really understand that something is good news if you know how things stood before the good news broke out, and exactly the same thing goes for Christianity. And you can see that in one of the Bible's most direct answers to this question we're looking at today. So the Apostle Paul writes to a little church in a place called Colossae, which today would be in south-central Turkey, and he tackles this question directly: what is the gospel? And he presents his answer in two parts. The first part is all about context, the bad news, and then from there he moves on to the good news, which you can see is good, kind of with the bad news as its foil. So this is his argument. He says, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behaviour. That's the bad news. And then good news, he says, but God has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. That's Colossians chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. Now there are obviously some depths to plumb there in terms of what in the world do all of those words mean. But the basic message is pretty simple, isn't it? Paul thinks that human beings like us are alienated from the one key relationship that's supposed to define us, relationship with our Creator. That's the bad news. And the good news is that reconciliation, reconstruction of that relationship is possible through Jesus. So let's think about that. That's all we're going to do this lunchtime, just take those two pieces and look at them a little bit more closely. So the first thing, the context, Paul says that we're alienated from God. And my thought is that actually for most of us that won't come as too much of a surprise. I think most people in the West at least would agree that we're in an advanced state of relational breakdown with God and all things religious. We're confused, we're conflicted, we don't know what's going on with any of this stuff. So in some ways alienation seems kind of normal to us. The discomforting thing though is that Paul perceives that alienation as a bad thing. Paul thinks alienation from God is not actually a mark of intellectual and spiritual progress. He thinks it's a mark of degeneration. And I think in Oxford that doesn't actually compute so well. Because here we place an incredibly high value, don't we, on self-sufficiency. The idea of being dependent on God doesn't really seem to work for us. We like independence of thought. And I guess as someone who's involved in Oxford as an institution, I would want to say, in some ways, brilliant. Self-sufficiency, independence of thought can carry us a long way. Creativity, entrepreneurial behaviour, imagination, research, that's partly what we're about. These are things that I think are fantastic parts of the human experience that God has wired into us. But in our culture, we don't just celebrate self-sufficiency and independence of thought as subordinate virtues, do we? I think what we think of them is that they're a life philosophy. We tell ourselves that we're captains of our own ships, masters of our own souls, and we don't just want to thankfully contribute our gifts in an effort to kind of uphold the way to good. We actually want to be able to define that good for ourselves and redefine it at our own convenience. We want to be in charge. And that's the place where this gospel that Paul has got here is going to find us. Because appealing though that sounds, self-sufficiency as a life philosophy has got some major problems. And I'm just going to highlight a few of them. I'm sure these will all be fairly obvious to us. So the first thing is just self-sufficiency as a life philosophy is elitist, isn't it? Kind of by definition. Maybe that's hard for us to spot because we live in such an elitist institution. But yeah, I don't know, you look around, you hear, maybe look around the people who you meet in college, it seems like every single person has broken through kind of incredible barriers and shown incredible determination, has outstanding talent, and that's the reason why they're here. But just a bit of a newsflash for that. So part of my role, I work at the end of the Michaelmas term most years doing admissions interviews. And one of the things that's really striking about admissions is just realising that we probably have 2 to 3 times more super talented, totally capable people who could thrive and survive here in Oxford. We have 2 to 3 more times that we can actually accommodate on our courses of those people that we deal with. So what about those people who have that same determination, who have that same body of talent, but just don't make it, who just don't get in? What about the people out there who have similar gifts and talents to us maybe, but who, for one reason or another, just never get even the opportunity to express them, who never get the chance to apply? Maybe because they live in a war zone, maybe because they're caring for elderly relatives. Or what about people who don't have that same set of gifts? Maybe people who sew our clothes or make our shoes. Are we really happy with a vision of life that says that the kind of independence and self-sufficiency that we prize as making life kind of essentially worth living is going to essentially render 95% of the world's population unable to play? You know, are their lives worthless in our estimation because they don't have that same opportunity for self-determination? It's pretty brutal when you put it like that, but it's easy to find yourself living like that unconsciously. So yeah, it's elitist. The next thing I guess I would say is that self-sufficiency as a life philosophy is also just unrealistic. Because even if you feel like you are the master of the world here in Oxford, and you can just kind of will the next thing you want to happen into existence by sheer force of your own brilliance, the reality is that it can't last. Whether we like it or not, we are dependent, however independent we want to say we are. So we're dependent on our bodies to keep working, aren't we? Even the minutest process of thought that's happening in your mind right now, the beating of your heart, none of us are making that happen by our own brilliance. Okay? We're dependent on the stability of our society. We're dependent on the strength of our relationships. We're dependent on the benignity of our environment. And tragically, all of that can, and probably many of us know that it can, come crashing down in an instant. I'm sure, you just have to look at the news to see that, don't you? Think about the people who were swept to their deaths in Valencia just a couple of days ago. Quite a lot of probably self-sufficient, independent people, but it didn't help them. Third thing, I guess, is just to say, look, self-sufficiency as a philosophy is also self-destructive. So this is like, even when it's working, even when you do get into the dream course at your dream university, even when it is actually seeming to be a realistic vision, Paul, I think, would warn us that by embracing that philosophy, we're actually passing deeper and deeper into a dangerous addiction. Tolkien, I think, has his finger on this when he talks about what it looks like to reach out and claim the crown of deity for ourselves. It's tempting, isn't it, to want to kind of name ourselves as the ultimate authority in our lives, to be the person who's like the originator of all the good things around us. But the reality is that however we experience it, that crown is really a curse for us. Tolkien says that it weighs 10,000 tons. And if for one moment you reach out and you drag it onto your own head, you will never be able to remove it. So it might look good to our peers, it might even look good to us, but it will crush us to death in the end. Self-sufficiency, total independence, if that's the thing that you most value, is a curse. And so the Bible positions self-sufficiency as bad news, however appealing it might seem to us. It grabs hold of people who kind of look in the mirror and see these kind of crown-wearing demigods, and it challenges us with a different vision. It pictures us as tenants living in a world that has been leased to us by the God who made it, and who have no interest in paying the rent. And nobody likes tenants like that, right? It's not half such an aspirational image as the whole demigod thing, is it? But I have to say, for me, and I don't know about you, we can talk about this in discussion afterwards, I think it's more realistic. The gifts we have, the opportunities that are spread out before us, every breath we draw, the very stability of the universe that we live in, these are things which have been given to us. I don't know where from, but they're not productions of our own great skill and ingenuity, are they? So where is the thanks? Where's the rent? And what should be the consequences? We're alienated from God, and that's the bad news. But obviously, in Paul's mind, that's not the end of the story he wants to tell. And so he states it and he means it, but he also is going to use that as the context from which he's going to announce a radical plot twist. And this is his gospel, his good news, the good news about Jesus. And just as he used a key word to kind of help us see the context, alienation was the word that he used, he's going to use another key word to help us understand God's response, and it's this: reconciliation. So alienation is what we've talked about so far. Reconciliation is where we're now going. So again, etymology, reconciliation is about mending broken relationships, isn't it? It's about restoring harmony where there's been disharmony, reconstructing trust where trust is broken down. It's about making a way where there isn't a way, overcoming hurt, offence, setting things back the way that they were supposed to be. And in Paul's argument, the specific kind of reconciliation he has in mind is restoring our harmony with God. This is the heart of his message, that if in some way this harmonious relationship with God can be recovered, reconciled, that it leaves us no longer striving for acceptance. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing to experience? I don't know about you, but I think under the surface in Oxford there's a lot of striving for acceptance going on. I'm still doing it, and I'm a long way down the track. It will leave us no longer toiling to prove ourselves again and again, climbing an endless ladder, rung after rung. It will leave us instead working for the sheer joy of it, with thankfulness for the opportunities spread out before us. And as we use those gifts, it will leave us conscious that what we're actually doing is not kind of carving our own niche so that the spotlight can fall on us for the rest of our lives, but actually what we're doing is we're sharing in things that God himself delights in, and that he has kind of given us the opportunity to participate in. So when we create things, we do that as people who are conscious that God is a creator and he's given us the opportunity to participate. When we organise things, we do it conscious that God too is an organiser. When we cherish and appreciate things, we do it conscious that God cherishes and appreciates the world that he's made. And we come to see that out of all the other beings in the universe, God has called us forward and given us this chance to be part of it. He said, look, I love this stuff. Making things, naming things, doing expansive, imaginative stuff. This is my thing, and now you try. And there's an incredible joy and intimacy for us there, I think. And that's where the gospel is kind of coming into land. It says that that's what you were made for that relationship. I don't know whether you're familiar with the screen on your phone in the deep down in the settings that turns all the network options on. Got it. Yeah. Hey, that one look familiar? Sorry for all the Android users. It's that's from my phone, and just as it stands, in that situation with your mobile data turned off, it doesn't change the fact, does it, that the phone is still, an astonishing object. So aesthetically, I think it's a really kind of like cool kind of zenith of creativity in some ways, tactile in terms of its tactility, in terms of its materials, the elegance of the interaction, the minute precision of it. If you were to cut your phone open and start looking at what's inside it under a microscope, it's incredibly intricate. Thinking about the sensors that it has and the way that it gives the phone a kind of an awareness of itself in space, all of that stuff is incredible. Your phone can do a lot without going online. So even with that setup, you can do photos, you can do games, you can do task apps. I love my task app. And you could stop and content yourself there, couldn't you? You could say, look, phone self-sufficiency is pretty cool. The phone just there in and of itself. But hopefully we all realise that self-sufficiency for a phone actually robs it of its true purpose, because the phone is designed for dependence. It's designed to connect. So as soon as you hit that button, everything changes. It goes online. It becomes the thing that it was made to be. So immediately you've got messaging, calling, streaming, navigation, the internet, the whole world of information, and then relationship, interaction, the possibilities to communicate with people you haven't seen for ages on the other side of the world. It's astonishing, isn't it? If you abandon that self-sufficient isolated existence for that device, and you turn on the uplink, that doesn't actually shackle and constrain your phone. It liberates it. Well, that's the fundamental claim of the Christian gospel that I think Paul's trying to make here. It's something like that. It's trying to say that somewhere deep down inside us, there's some kind of setting screen that looks a little bit like this, with human-divine interaction turned off. And Paul's invitation to us is that suddenly the whole thing for which you were made lights up in an instant. And I wonder whether you've ever dared to imagine that that might actually be true. That you were designed to connect. That you were designed not just for these amazing horizontal or interpersonal interactions that we all enjoy so much, and for these interactions with the subjects that we study and with the world around us. All of that is amazing. But has it ever occurred to you that actually the whole reason why you are this extraordinary being with all these capacities is ultimately for one specific thing? You were purpose-built for relationship with God. That's what it means to be a Christian, to step into that exciting adventure of spiritual intimacy. Now, I guess the question that Paul is interested in his good news is not just that is a thing, but how it can happen. So remember, the word that Paul chose here was reconciliation. And reconciliation, if you've ever been involved in any kind of reconciliation, you will know that's a costly process. The good news of Christianity, he says, is that we have been reconciled by Christ's physical body through death, that we might be presented holy in his sight without blemish and free from accusation. That's the gospel. The good news from the distant battlefield is that Jesus was treated as if he had been a thankless, wayward tenant in God's world, so that we can now be treated as God's daughters and sons. Jesus took the consequences of our alienation on himself, so that we can enjoy the nearness and proximity to God that were his by right. That's the distinctively Christian understanding of the gospel that we were going for at the start. And it actually, I think, gives us another nice little Oxford moment here to challenge the question with which we started. So we asked ourselves simply, what is the gospel? But I think in the end it kind of slightly misses the reality, because at its core, the gospel is not a what. The gospel is a who. The gospel is Jesus, who achieved that reconciliation by being alienated in our place. So the gospel isn't just a string of interesting abstract concepts. It's a real individual who every single one of us can trust and worship, discovering in the process that's the very thing for which we were made. So I suppose, just in closing, before we go to Q&A, my recommendation to you is just do yourself a favour this term and investigate this. If what I've said to you this lunchtime is actually real, it is the most exciting thing that you will discover during your time at Oxford. I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. If it's really true that there is a an omnipresent supernatural intelligence out there from which we come, and that it's actually possible to be in dynamic interaction with that being, that is more important, more astonishing than anything you will see down a microscope here, anything you will find in an old book. It just is, isn't it? So do yourself a favour and consider it. Read one of the contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teaching. There were several of them on the table on the back. Engage with this guy who seems to just be living right in the very centre of that dependence that Paul thinks we're made for. He has an incredible authenticity, an incredible intimacy with God. When you read about it, you're just like, if only I could just have a nano fragment of that thing that he's got, that would completely revolutionise my life. And as you read, you hear him say, come, let me take the consequences of your bad choices on myself, let me lift that crown off your head, and in return, take the consequences of the life that I've lived, step into that intimacy yourself, be forgiven and accepted, and run with it. That's the gospel. Now, none of us, of course, want to admit that we need that. I'm sure that this is the case for all of us here. It's still very much the case for me. We would so much rather, wouldn't we, take charge of our own salvation. If it turns out that we need a saviour, we would very much like to do it ourselves, even if the thing that we need saving from is our own self-sufficiency. We're really badly messed up. But in the Gospels, Jesus says, come on, don't be afraid. Don't do that to yourself. Let me help you. And if there are anyone here who